Wanted volunteers to take a cruise, eat, have a great time, enjoy the ship before they get back to sailing with paying passengers. The catch? You have to be willing to test an entirely new cruise experience that hasn't been proven. Even so, the chance to sail aboard a ship before they return to sailing for the general public and to enjoy taking a cruise is too good to pass up for many people, but not everyone will be eligible. With the end of the CDC's no sail order, the agency isn't just giving cruises the green light to get back to sailing. Instead, the order has been replaced with something called a framework for conditional sailing. This framework lays out criteria that cruise lines must follow if they want to get back to sailing with paying passengers. While there are a number of steps, one of these is that cruise lines must take part in simulated voyages. These trips, they're exactly what they sound like. They're test cruises. With the new way of cruising, dozens of changes are taking place to the cruise experience. Everything from check-in to hanging out by the pool to having dinner in the buffet is changing. With so many changes and the potential risks if someone gets sick, the CDC wants cruise lines to practice what life will be like on the ship and even in the terminal. This gives everyone, including the authorities, cruise lines, and the crew, a chance to get things right instead of using the first paying passengers as guinea pigs. There is no word on how many test cruises a ship must make. The agency simply says that they must make, quote, simulated voyage or a series of simulated voyages, demonstrating the cruise ship operator's ability to mitigate the risks of the illness. Of course, many people want to know if they can take one of these cruises as a volunteer. After all, even with the risks, cruise lines are implementing new procedures to lessen the chances of getting sick. And as we've seen, everyone has different risk tolerances for the virus. However, not everyone is eligible to be a volunteer. The CDC lays out their criteria within the framework. If you want to be a volunteer cruise passenger, then you'll need to be at least 18 years old per CDC rules. So families with kids won't be allowed to sail. There's no upper age limit set out, despite older people being more at risk for complications with the virus. As part of the criteria to be an eligible volunteer, you must also not have any conditions that will put you at risk if you do get sick. The CDC asked for written certification from, quote, a healthcare provider that a volunteer has no pre-existing conditions that put them at higher risk. So expect the volunteers to be fit and healthy. Finally, if you wanted to get paid for this sailing, don't expect it. The government says that volunteers must sail on a, quote, consensual basis. Volunteer passengers can't be compensated or allowed to sail as a condition of employment. In other words, they are to be true volunteers, not people that are paid to be there. While the allure of getting to sail on a cruise as a volunteer is exciting, what are passengers actually getting into? Here are some ideas of what to expect based on the guidance from the CDC. Number 1, before you even board, expect to be reminded that there is a risk of cruising during this crisis. In fact, the CDC points to a study that the reproduction rate aboard the Diamond Princess was 14.8 before quarantine was enacted. That means for each infected person, it was spread to almost 15 others on the ship. This figure is about 4 times higher than what was seen in Wuhan, China at the start of the outbreak. For that reason, the CDC requires cruise lines to notify volunteers in writing that they are taking part in a simulation of, quote, unproven and untested health and safety protocols, close quote, and that sailing during a pandemic is an inherently risky activity. Number 2, the entire point of the simulated voyage is to test the new procedures in a real-world environment. For that reason, the trip is required to have many of the same components seen on a normal cruise. On the simulated voyages, cruise lines must test embarkation and debarkation procedures, including checking in at a terminal. On the ship, they need to test dining policies and entertainment venue protocols. This includes how to serve food safely and ensuring social distancing in places like theaters and casinos. The trip will also feature modified private island excursions. In addition, the CDC says cruise lines need to test some things you hope to not see on a normal cruise, including evacuation procedures, isolating of infected passengers, and quarantining of other passengers and crew. Third, as part of this new framework, the government is requiring cruise lines to make testing a major part of their return to sailing. On a normal cruise, tests are to be conducted on passengers on embarkation day before they board the ship and on debarkation day before returning home. This will also be required on the volunteer cruises. Finally, many of the same policies that are in place on land are set to be on the simulated voyage with volunteers. The rules laid out by the CDC call for, quote, hand hygiene, face coverings, and social distancing for passengers and crew, close quote. Many people have said that they won't cruise if face masks are required as it lessens their enjoyment of a vacation. If you want to sail a volunteer cruise or be a paying passenger when cruises do return, expect face masks to be a requirement. Now, at this point, it's still not clear when simulated voyages will begin, but we do have some general ideas. First, before a simulated cruise can begin, the cruise line must meet requirements on cruise safety, which includes weekly testing and having a no-sail order response plan in place. From there, cruise lines must also give the CDC at least 30 days advance notice of a simulated voyage. So there are no set dates for these voyages yet announced. Norwegian Cruise Line suggested that some cruise lines could start them in December, but they were looking at early January as a possibility, although even that was not certain. Quote, "Don't pin me down to an exact date," said Norwegian Cruise Line's holding CEO Frank Del Rio, "but I would tell you that there's a chance that maybe some companies can start these trial cruises in December. We don't forecast that we will be wanting to do so until probably sometime in January." So how do you get to be a volunteer on one of these cruises? That's a question that's still unanswered for some lines, but it is getting a little bit clearer. Remember, this framework to return to sailing is unprecedented. The details of how it will work are still being considered. Royal Caribbean, they now have a form and a Facebook group to submit your interest in being a volunteer cruise passenger. We have links to both in the description below. Norwegian Cruise Lines hasn't laid out criteria for volunteers, but as said earlier, they mentioned they're looking at test cruises possibly beginning in January. As for other lines, it's still wait and see. At this point, it's not even clear if there will be an open call for volunteers across all lines, if some cruise lines will simply reach out to past guests, or some other method of deciding who will get the opportunity to sail. However they are chosen, expect the number of spots to be limited and in demand. Multiple companies have cited strong demand for cruises whenever they do return, and the chance to be a volunteer on one of the first trips back will be historic. It seems likely that being flexible and living within driving distance of a port would be beneficial if there is a call for volunteers. The return process is fluid and it's not clear when or where these simulated voyages will take place. Being able to get to a port quickly could be a benefit. For more details, be sure to follow us at Cruzely.com, where we will continue to update readers as the volunteer process develops.